good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to ask you to take your seats so we can start off this very important session this afternoon. Thank you very much. I know there's a lot of conversation, good conversation taking place right now, but I invite you to take your seats so that we can redeem some time. This is a very important session that we'd like to dedicate as much time as possible to it. My name is Alan Kasuja. I'll be your moderator this afternoon, and thank you very much for making time to be a part of this important discussion as to where the future jobs are. Amongst the audience, I noticed very many distinguished people. I'll be acknowledging those in the due process. In the meantime, though, I'd like to introduce you to my distinguished panel, starting not least with Professor Justin Lin from Peking University. Professor Lin is the first Chinese to graduate with a PhD from Chicago University. He's also the first man from a developing country to head or to become the chief economist of the World Bank. I'd also like to introduce you to Mr. V. Shankar. Mr. V. Shankar runs Standard Chartered Bank, pretty much most of it except Asia. He's in charge of Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas. Thank you very much for joining us. And also joining us this afternoon is the Honorable Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development from Nigeria, that's Dr. Akinwumi Adesina. And we'll also be joined this afternoon by Professor Carlos Lopez. Is Professor Lopez with us today? Yes, Professor Lopez is here. I was a bit unsure there for a second. He's, of course, from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And we will be joined this afternoon by another very important guest. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to stand up as we welcome His Excellency Macky Sall, who is the President of the Republic of Senegal. Let's stand up and welcome him, please. His Excellency President Macky Sall. Is he here yet? Okay, his people tell me he's not here yet. So let's get the conversation started as we wait for him. I promise it's good exercise. Besides, it's been a long afternoon. When he comes in, don't say that we stood up for you earlier on and you didn't show up. Let's just stand up again and get started. Now, I know there are very many thoughts about what has been transpiring so far. And as we wait for President Macky Sall to come in, I just want to hear you. Or before we introduce President Macky Sall, let's acknowledge the presence of His Excellency Benjamin Mkapa, former President of the Republic of Tanzania. We from Uganda love President Mkapa very much. He's an ancestor of Makerere University. Oh, by the way, my name is Alan Kasuja from the BBC. Now, do we have some microphones in the audience? I think we do. I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear your thoughts about moving forward. Are you happy with what the discussions that are taking place at this meeting? Is there something that you'd like to hear discussed? And remember that this afternoon we are talking about a demographic dividend. We are talking about Africa in 40 years, when we have 1 billion more Africans, when the population of the continent is at 2.3 billion. We are talking about a time when Africa will have a labor force of 1.4 billion young people. What is going to happen to those people? Is it going to be, are we going to see the reemergence of slave trade where people will be shipped off to work elsewhere? Or are we going to see Africa take advantage of that very important dividend? So, or turn that into a dividend, that very important demographic. So, do you have any thoughts at all? Anybody at all that would like to say something that they haven't said yet, but would like to say in this forum? This is what you do when you're a moderator and an important guest hasn't shown up yet. You find creative ways of engaging the audience, because the discussion can't start without the very important guest. But he's on his way down, from what I've had. Anybody else? We'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Madame Zuma, who is, of course, the chair of the African Union. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. So, let me just start a conversation with Professor Justin Lin. Professor Lin, you started off as an agriculture economist, did you not? and then you transitioned into becoming one of the world's leading development economies. Could you just explain what that journey was like?
Well, look into China 35 years ago. The situation was very similar to the African continents. At that time, China had 1 billion population. 80% of them live in rural areas. And the per capita income in China was less than 1/3 of the average in sub-Saharan African country, taking South Africa away. Only those middle income, low income African country. China was less than 1/3 of that. Certainly, China transformed a lot in the past 35 years because China grew at a rate of 9.8%. And the reason why China could grow so fast, because China utilized the advantage of a large supply of young labor and put them into the use in the sectors which labor intensive. And so they are consistent with China's competitive advantages. They are competitive. And with competitiveness, certainly China accumulated capitals, gradually move up the ladders. So now China is a country with per capita income of $6,800 last year.
I just wonder how much of that per capita income, how much of that progress is as a result of the ability to access resources in Africa and take them to China and turn those. How much has Africa contributed to the growth of China?
I think a lot, because China is a resources-poor country. Without the resources from the resources-rich continent, like Africa, like the Middle East, like Latin America, China could not grow as fast as it used to be. But I also like to mention, China also contributes to the growth of Africa.
How?
Because in the last 20 years, resources price increased a lot. That benefit the resources-rich continent like Africa. At the same time, with the growth of the wage in China, China now coming to the second stage of China-African cooperation. It's to relocate the labor-intensive manufacturing sectors to African countries. How large the possibility of that? Currently, China employs 150 million workers in light manufacturing sectors. About half of that, 85 million, will be relocated in the coming years.
It's also true that the labor cost in China is higher than it was.
Much higher, about 10 times.
It's higher than it was 15 years ago.
Right.
I wonder, so is that an opportunity for Africa at the moment?
Certainly. If you will not capture that opportunity, you have to wait another 20 years or 30 years.
Okay.
Because we know how come that, we know that in the 1960s, Japan reached the same stage as China today. Japan started to relocate its labor-intensive industries because of rising wages. And Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, to some extent, Indonesia and Thailand captured the opportunity. So they transformed themselves from agrarian economy, low-income countries, to middle-income, new industrialized, and now some even high income.
Okay, let me just
in the 1980s, those 4 East Asian tigers, they reached the same stage. The wage rate started to increase. China captured that opportunities. So China transformed itself from a low-income agrarian economy into the factory of the world. And now China reached the same stage of Japan in the 1960s, the same stage of Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore in the 1980s. And if Africa would not capture these opportunities and allow other continents to capture the opportunities, I think Africa has to wait at least another 20 years for the opportunity or window to come.
Let me just bring in Dr. Adesina. I'm very keen to hear from you. I mean, for nothing else, because Africa's China is actually Nigeria. And Nigeria has the biggest population. And unfortunately, there are also certain problems with it, and not least the fact that it also has the biggest number of uneducated children. And the key question is here, an important country like that, What needs to happen in your mind for it to turn that corner, for it to start punching in its weight category rather than punching below its weight?
Well, I mean, let me first say that I want to speak from the broad perspective on Africa, not just from Nigeria, but I'll say a few points on that at the end. I think this particular panel is very important because we have a situation where 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are on this continent. And this continent is growing at roughly about 5.3%, according to IMF projections. But we are growing, but we're not creating jobs. At least we are not creating jobs enough, good quality jobs enough. And that actually brings in a lot of fragility to us as a continent. Because if you look at very much of the fragile states that we have, where we have a lot of challenges, the presidents were talking about it yesterday. 1 out of 2 youth that actually pick up arms to go and fight, they do that because they don't actually have jobs. So the issue of jobs for us is not just an economic issue. It is a national, regional, continental security matter. And we have to treat it with that level of seriousness. I think when you look at our youth bulge, okay, you've got 200 million people in Africa, young people in Africa today, between the age of 15 and 24. So this continent is the youth continent, really, in the world, right? But if you look at the working population, which is your population between the age of 15 and 64, this is growing at about 13 million every year on this continent. Now, that means that by about 2030, we'll have roughly 1 billion people there that we have to employ. Well, the challenge is that 10 million of those entering the labor market are actually the young people, and they can't find the jobs. And so the issues I think we need to look at all across the continent is why is that happening? Part of the problem, I think, not just in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Tanzania, everywhere, is that we have a major mismatch between the skills of those that we are training today and the needs of that labor market. I'll give you an example. Take a look at those that are being trained in universities today. Only 3%, or maybe even 2%, of those being trained in our universities today are in ICT. 12% of them are actually in areas of science. Majority of them are in traditional areas that government has always employed people. So it's, whether it's social sciences and things like that. Not to say that those things are not important, but those are the areas where we have people. So when the industry is growing and you have a structural shift in which the demand is for ICT, engineering, and so on, you don't have the skills to actually match it. There are lots of jobs that we can't actually fill. The other thing is that take agriculture. This continent is blessed. I always say that, you throw up anything in this continent. Before it hits ground, it can grow, right? We have the land, we have the water, we have cheap labor, and nobody drinks oil or gas, everybody eats food, right? But the problem is that we've not been taking agriculture as a very dynamic sector that can actually create those jobs. The fact is that by 2030, this agriculture and agribusiness sector is going to be worth $1 trillion on this continent. And so we've got to actually begin to ask, are we actually training people, getting them excited to actually create jobs in this particular sector? 2% of all of our graduates in universities today in Nigeria, in Ghana, everywhere are in agriculture. So we've got to do that. So the point I want to say is that if we are going to play in the big league, it's not just Nigeria playing the big league. 2 things must change for me. First, find those sectors in which you can create massive amount of jobs that will leave millions of people out of poverty in a sustainable way. And secondly, begin to deal with this massive mismatch between the skills we have and where the labor markets are going. So that means that we've got to work with the private sector to create many and many of those jobs. So I don't think you're playing in the big league if you're spending $35 billion buying food that you should be producing, exporting jobs out of the continent instead of making others richer while you're creating oceans of poverty right here at home. And I think to play in the big league, you must turn your comparative advantage into real serious competitive advantage that creates massive amount of jobs.
Thank you very much for that. Let me just bring in Mr. Shankar. Mr. Shankar, like I told you, is from Standard Chartered Bank, and one of the challenges you find is people are talking about developing skills, making sure they have the right skills and that sort of thing. But money remains very expensive on the continent. Without the skills, even if the skills existed and money was still expensive, it doesn't help create the sorts of opportunities that the young people on the continent need.
I think the good news is that there's more money available today than 5 years ago. So if you talk to a very successful entrepreneur like Aliko Dangote and go and ask him about the trials and tribulations he suffered in order to raise what today looks like modest sums of money from the Nigerian banking system when he established his first cement plant, there's a sea change. Today he is doing a $9 billion project and is able to raise financing both from the continent, within the continent, as well as in international markets.
But you're talking about one person.
It's not just one person. There are many such success stories. If you look at the development which is happening in Africa, it's not happening without money. And the good news is that you're also seeing the emergence of regional financial institutions. It's not just international capital. But here is the but. For capital to come to Africa, there are few enabling preconditions. And that's true for anywhere, not just Africa, for anywhere. Number one, you need macroeconomic stability. And it's not just, I would just say stability, it's not just macroeconomic, it's also political stability. You also need a stable set of policies that don't change overnight. The second thing I would say is security is important. And security in its many manifestations, including the point that the minister made about, if you don't create the jobs, you won't have the security. And the third thing is this very secular, broad-minded leadership. So if you take the examples of, let's say, moving away from the continent, look at China or Singapore or Dubai, I would attribute the success to what I like to call the 3 S's: stability, security, and secularism, which is happening in Africa. Africa, the governance is improving over the last several decades. It's becoming a safer place. There are less conflicts. There are conflicts, but less so. And that is why Africa is becoming a happy hunting ground for international capital. But, and here's the other but, we can't just depend on debt financing. It's important, but that's not the be-all and end-all of existence, because at some point of time, you need to repay the debt. It is very often, I find finance ministers very excited about the latest bond issue they did for 10 years at a low coupon and how it is trading very well and everything else. That's great stuff. But don't forget that we all would do much better if we had equity capital. And so the policies you can create to have foreign direct investment come in, and Africa needs it, as well as the development of very robust and vibrant domestic equity markets is also important. What Africa lacks today is equity in scale. Even take the 2 biggest exchanges, South Africa and Nigeria, right? When you go beyond them, you don't have too many exchanges with scale. So even I'll stay with the same example of Aliko Dangote just to keep it simple. If tomorrow he needs to go and raise additional capital, a lot of it needs to come from the international capital markets, equity markets, as opposed to Africa. So I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you very much for that. Let me just turn to Mr. Lopez at the moment. You will know him, of course, as the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. This report that was released by ASET in March of this year, which suggests that there is insufficient trickle down, that there is a lot of growth, but the trickle down is just not there. And as a result, what you have is Africa's transformation is taking a bit too long. 2040 is not too far away. What do you think are some of the things the continent needs to be doing in order to ensure that when the other 1 billion people show up, it will be ready to absorb them?
Well, thank you. I think we have a like-minded group here, so people are more or less in the same wavelength in terms of proposals of what would make a difference in terms of Africa's transformation and how we can create jobs, which is basically not rely only on growth, but making sure that we have quality growth, which basically means in practical terms that we need more productivity in agriculture for sure. Then, it will propel the possibilities of industrialization, starting with agribusiness. Then we'll have modern service sector that are basically going to create what we could call wage earners, because about 1/3 of the jobs that are created in a way that really correspond to this definition, and the other 2/3 are just very precarious and not really comfortable. They will not fit what we call decent jobs. But let's take the issue from a completely different angle to understand the depth of your question. Africa doesn't have that much of a social welfare, right? So if people really are counting that they are going to have a pension and so on, you are talking about a very, very tiny minority, which basically means that most people have to do something to survive. They have to have some sort of an activity. They have to be able to basically feed themselves, which basically means that you have a lot of occupational activity that is not translated into jobs. In order for us to have jobs instead of that, a number of things have to happen, starting with policy coherence, the easy ones. But then, if you go deeper into what really makes a big difference, I would say what makes a big difference is basically being able to create a conducive environment for industrialization. And industrialization seen from its larger perspective, not just manufacturing. And, Justin Lin is one of the people that have alerted that Africans really need to be watching what is happening in China, because a lot of jobs are going to move out of China, and Africa stands a chance of becoming, if not the factory floor of the world, one of the factory floors of the world. But I want to put 3 qualifications on what Justin Lin has been saying, just for the sake of our conversation. The first one, let's look into what China is doing in Africa. And most of what it's doing, in terms of investment, is less than 5% of Chinese investment in the world. So which basically means we are residual still, even for China, very residual. And we need more. We need much more. So how do we attract much more from China and others is very important. The second caveat that I think is very important to mention, China is in a very tense neighborhood. Just follow the news. Just follow the news of today and yesterday, what is happening in Vietnam. You can go on with examples. And that basically means it is in the interest of China to have alternatives. And Africa definitely is one of the alternatives. And then the third caveat is that even if China comes with its jobs and investment and tries to make it happen in Africa for their sake, but also our advantage, then what we still don't have in terms of ingredients internally to us is a strategy to deal with these possibilities. A continental strategy and a country strategy. Some countries are more articulate than others, but in general, we lack a continental strategy. And that brings us
Can
to
that
the debate.
continental strategy be achieved given the diversity of this continent?
But look, when Deng Xiaoping, dreamed of a different China, it was a very simple dream. It was, how come, the Chinese are so good in Singapore, they are so good in Taiwan, they are so good in Hong Kong, and, there is a problem of productivity and conditions here in China. It's because, the conditions were different. So let's create those conditions. That's special economic zones. And those special economic zones are going to import, the learning and the knowledge from these different parts of the world where Chinese have prospered.
Okay.
We have the same in Africa.
Just hold that thought for me, Mr. Carlos Lopez. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand up one more time as we welcome His Excellency President Macky Sall of the Republic of Senegal. Let's give him a round of applause for making time to speak to us. I promise you I was told that he's coming in. Sorry. Okay, President Kaberuka is coming in at this point. And we still hope that President Macky Sall will make time to speak to us after he meets His Excellency Paul Kagame. They're in a meeting at the moment, hence his absence. But then again, Dr. Kaberuka deserves a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. May you please take your seats? I'm sure he won't mind us. And please.
So when you say that.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
So when you say this session was standing room only, you mean it?
I do. But again, I do apologize for interrupting the point you're making, and I ask you to just complete it if you can.
Yes. Now, basically, what I'm saying is that we are not going to make it really in Africa if we approach these issues country by country. This is about having an integrated strategy. It's about regional integration partly, but more than just regional integration as a slogan. It's about having strategies to deal with our key partners, China being obviously a very important one for all the reasons we know. But it's also the same in relation to Europe, the same in relation to the US, all the big investors in the continent. And with all due respect in terms of how we can mobilize private equity, which I think is extremely important, I think the point that I really like on everything Shankar said is the issue of mobilizing domestic resource capabilities, including markets that really have the possibilities in the continent.
Where will that money come from, domestically?
Well, you'll be amazed. I'm
going to ask you that question briefly and then bring you in as well. Answer it. His Excellency President Macky Sall, ladies and gentlemen. President Macky Sall is accompanied by Dr. Kaberuka. Thank you for coming, Your Excellency. Ladies and gentlemen, President Macky Sall. And President Macky Sall is going to make a statement in a moment. And I'm really keen to hear about what he's doing in Senegal, because his economy has ambitious plans for his country. But we were, at this point, wondering about raising domestic capital. And Mr. Lopez, you're about to say something to that effect.
Well, if you take into account African reserves, if you take into account Africa's commercial banks' capital that is not moving, because we have very lazy banks, not yours. If we take into account the number of assets that are in our pension funds and others, the sovereign funds, if you pull all these resources together, plus the mispricing of our natural resources, we are talking about something close to $1 trillion of capital in Africa that can be partially mobilized for development. This is not happening because of the rules of the game, and we need to change those rules.
Mr. Shankar, I want you to weigh in on that point. Just pick up from where he's left off.
I violently agree with what Carlos is saying. Absolutely. I think mobilizing domestic savings is important. But here's a broader point, and that's not just true for Africa. If we took global savings, which is investable assets, AUM, it is roughly $87 trillion. $73 trillion of that, or about 87%, is managed out of the West, whereas all the surpluses are today being generated in the East or the South, whatever you want to call the emerging markets. So I think both as an offensive strategy and a defensive strategy, the emerging markets, the countries of the South or the East, need to bring asset management business as a real business back to their shores. Otherwise, all our markets are going to be exposed to the whims and fancies of what happens in the West. When they sneeze, we have a cold, we have a cough.
Interesting point. Before President Macky Sall makes his remarks, I'd like to invite you, Professor Lin. You wanted to make an intervention.
I think the capital is a lot out there. But whether they come to Africa or not is a big issue. But how to make them want to come to Africa voluntarily? You need to show capital coming into here, will generate a high return to the investors. But if you can generate successful investment cases, then your story will be convincing. I can give you one example. Ethiopia, before 2012, it had such a hard time to attract foreign direct investment to come to Ethiopia. But because of success story of Huajian shoe factory, headed by the lady Helen Haidea, within 1 year, it turned into a remarkable success stories. And after that, all of a sudden, Ethiopia becomes such a hot place for attracting foreign direct investment. For example, the new industrial park that initiated by Ethiopian government in the year 2013, the first phase, they plan to build 22 factory units. Only 8 built. The other 14 are on the plan. But within 3 months, without much advertisement, all those 22 units has been taken away. When I mean taken away is that all those investors already placed one pledge, 1 year's of rent to the Ethiopian government. And the reason why all of a sudden it changed to the perception, because now it proved that Ethiopia can be a success place for the manufacturing. So I think it's very important. We don't have to wait. I'm sure every government in Africa has the ability to mobilize the domestic resources, to strategize those kind of resources to make sure to have some success story. And once you have success story, the investor will put your country on the map, and then will come to your country voluntarily. And as I said, a lot of money there, but just whether to come.
Thank you very much, Professor Lin. Now let's switch to His Excellency Macky Sall. Now, Senegal, you're leading Senegal through a diversification process. You basically have decided to invest a bit more in turning it into a hub that will be a regional leader in tourism, move away from fishing and agriculture, basically, in transport and in logistics as well. That's where you want to pay, that's where you want to concentrate. I'm wondering, moving forward, what sorts of preparations are you making for the young people? Because we are discussing the future jobs. Where are these future jobs going to come from in your mind?
Je vous remercie. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I will speak in French. So, premièrement, je voudrais remercier le président Kagame qui a bien voulu m'inviter à l'occasion des assemblées générales de la BAD et remercier mon frère ami, le président Kabiruka, ainsi que la Banque africaine de développement, saluer son rôle et ses performances sur le continent. Saluer également le président Babacar Ndiaye à côté, ainsi que l'ensemble des administrateurs, gouverneurs de la banque, et saluer l'ensemble du public. Vous dire tout le plaisir que j'ai à me retrouver à Kigali pour partager avec vous une problématique qui se pose à l'ensemble des gouvernements de la planète. Comment trouver de l'emploi pour la jeunesse? C'est un défi qui se pose de façon globale, surtout à notre continent, qui est un continent jeune par sa population, une jeunesse dynamique, une démographie parfois non contrôlée, donc de graves problèmes de planification de l'accès aux infrastructures sociales, aux infrastructures économiques. Alors, si nous voulons, partant de bons indicateurs sur la croissance africaine telle qu'elle est aujourd'hui, on peut se réjouir de la tendance positive vers une croissance de plus en plus développante pour le continent. Mais si l'on regarde avec beaucoup plus d'attention, on doit quand même modérer cet enthousiasme, puisque notre croissance montre des signes de fragilité. C'est une croissance qui est basée pour l'essentiel sur l'exportation de matières premières non transformées, avec tout ce que cela comporte comme fragilité sur la détérioration des termes de l'échange, absence de valeur ajoutée Et donc, cette croissance n'est pas porteuse en vérité d'emplois. Si on regarde de très près, c'est dans le secteur minier, principalement dans le secteur des hydrocarbures, un peu dans le secteur agricole. Je pense, et le Sénégal avec moi, que nous devons aujourd'hui, pour asseoir une croissance inclusive, créatrice d'emplois, mettre l'accent d'abord sur des secteurs porteurs de croissance, des clusters tels que l'agriculture associée à l'agro-industrie, où nous allons prendre en charge le volet agriculture familiale, le moderniser, augmenter la productivité par les rendements et la production, et en même temps passer à l'étape industrielle de la transformation de nos productions agricoles. Cela aura le mérite, d'une part, d'occuper une population active assez importante. Et aujourd'hui, l'agriculture ne fait plus fuir la jeunesse parce que c'est un secteur moderne qui peut être modernisé. Il n'y a plus de honte à être agriculteur lorsqu'on peut tirer plus de revenus que ce que le fonctionnaire ou bien le commerçant peut avoir à partir de ses champs et de ses exploitations. Ça, c'est un élément important, je pense, que nous devons mettre en accent. Donc l'agriculture doit être le premier secteur. Le second secteur, c'est le secteur industriel. Puisque notre commerce international, malheureusement, est resté marginal. D'abord, l'Afrique ne commerce pas avec l'Afrique par un défaut d'infrastructure. Pour venir à Kigali, si on n'a pas un avion particulier, on est obligé très souvent de remonter par Bruxelles ou par Amsterdam, parfois par Nairobi et Abuja, et j'allais dire, pardon, et Johannesburg. Il nous faut régler la question de l'interconnexion des voies de communication sur le continent. Et c'est le fameux projet NEPAD avec le PIDA qui doit prendre en charge cette construction de l'infrastructure africaine qui devra permettre le développement du commerce intra-africain, gage pour une transformation de nos productions minières, de nos productions pétrolières, pour donner plus de valeur ajoutée, plus d'emplois dans le secteur industriel. Le professeur Justin Lee vient de le dire, ce qui a été fait en Éthiopie nous a aussi inspiré. Depuis quelques mois, il est passé à Dakar et nous entendons dans 1 ou 2 mois, en tout cas, lancer une plateforme industrielle de transformation. Le Sénégal y travaille avec d'autres partenaires pour financer lui-même les premières infrastructures. Je pense donc que la vision de la transformation des productions en Afrique va être la voie par laquelle nous allons booster l'emploi et la croissance inclusive. Maintenant, il y a tous les autres secteurs du continent. Le tourisme peut beaucoup apporter à l'Afrique. Les infrastructures, la construction même des voies de communication, des chemins de fer, des routes, de l'énergie, autant de secteurs bien tenus, bien maîtrisés pourront être une des sources de création d'emplois. Évidemment, il faut corréler ces besoins de transformation aux besoins de formation qui vont de pair, puisque nous avons encore malheureusement une formation théorique, généraliste. Or, de plus en plus, il nous faut une formation professionnelle, une formation technique, scientifique, pour que l'Afrique également puisse produire la main-d'œuvre chargée elle-même de mettre à niveau nos infrastructures. Voilà un peu, si vous voulez, ce que je voulais dire. Et nous avons engagé une réforme au Sénégal dans le domaine de la réforme foncière, puisqu'on ne peut pas moderniser l'agriculture si on ne définit pas le type de relation entre le fermier traditionnel, l'agrobusiness, les autres usages de la terre tels que l'élevage, eh bien, les activités connexes de l'industrie, de la transformation. Donc, cette réflexion, nous pensons, devra, avant la fin de cette année, nous donner un modèle d'utilisation du foncier, un modèle d'accès, mais aussi faire en sorte que les assiettes foncières puissent être valorisées au niveau bancaire afin de lever des financements. Bon, c'est tout cela qui est en marche aujourd'hui et que nous essayons de mettre en œuvre à côté du développement du partenariat public-privé dans bien des domaines.
His Excellency Macky Sall, thank you very much. Right now, I'd like to open up the discussion to the floor. I wonder if there's anybody at all that would like to say something in this regard. Could we have a microphone at the front, please, if we can? Just introduce yourself and tell us and make the point you'd like to make. Okay, the microphones will be with us in a few moments. But in the meantime, if you would like to contribute, you're more than welcome to do that. Could we have the microphones? Yes, thank you very much. Let's start with this gentleman at the front, if we can.
Hi, my name is Mustafa. I have a question for Mr. Lin from China. We all know how important FDI is for job creation, especially for Africa. When I was a bit younger, the first thing I've learned from China is give a man a fish and you'll feed him a day, and teach him how to fish and you'll feed him for a lifetime. And lately what I've been seeing with the relationship that African countries in general are having with Chinese is they'll come, they'll invest, but what are we receiving at the end of the day? It's just the infrastructure. No technology transformation, no employing local people in these projects. My question is, what do you think that this attitude can definitely impact in job creation in Africa?
Is it an unbalanced relationship between China and Africa?
Well, you are right. In the past, the investment from China were mainly in mining and infrastructure. But as I mentioned, it will be a new era of African-China cooperation. As you know, that the Prime Minister Li Keqiang came to Africa just last week. And he made a new statement about the strategy of China-African cooperation. The number one is helping African countries to have industrialization, develop the job creation, labor-intensive industries. And that is the secret of the success in China since the 1980s. That was the success, there's a secret of success of Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong since the 1960s. And I think that if we can try to facilitate those kind of cooperations, I'm sure, just like you say, African countries will learn how to fish instead of just receive fish from China or any country. In terms of job transport, technological transport, I think the young lady, Helen Hai, could tell the story much better than I do. How does she transfer the technology which produce designer shoes for European market, for the US market competitively within just 3 months?
Okay,
so
we'll have an opportunity for Helen to come up and share her story with us. Let me have you as the back, if you can, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Cheikh Tidiane Dieye. I'm from Senegal. I'm the director of African Center for Trade, Integration and Development. I would like to speak in French. Hopefully the President Macky Sall is here. La question qui est posée à ce panel est une question simple. Où sont les emplois? Et de bonnes réponses et de très bonnes idées ont été exprimées ici. Je voudrais juste raconter une histoire personnelle qui permet en partie de répondre à cette question. Je suis allé au Vietnam en janvier et en avril dans le cadre d'une mission avec le Centre du commerce international de Genève et l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie pour accompagner des chefs d'entreprise de l'Afrique de l'Ouest pour faire des échanges dans le cadre de la transformation agroalimentaire. Nous avons visité des entreprises de transformation de noix d'acajou. Une des entreprises que nous avons visitées, il y en a eu beaucoup, transforme 25 000 tonnes de noix d'acajou par an. Sur les 25 000 tonnes, seulement les 5 000 sont achetées au Vietnam, les 20 000 sont importées d'Afrique de l'Ouest, du Sénégal, de la Guinée-Bissau et du Bénin, par des intermédiaires de Singapour. Ils font 15 millions de dollars de chiffre d'affaires, 1 millier d'emplois rien que pour cette entreprise, et je me suis dit, en les regardant, tout emploi qu'ils ont créé chez eux est un emploi que nous avons perdu chez nous. Si nous prenons le Sénégal, la Guinée-Bissau et d'autres pays, tous ensemble, nous atteignons difficilement 1000 emplois, alors qu'eux, une seule entreprise peut faire. Donc les emplois sont effectivement dans les pays qui se sont donné les capacités de transformation. Et je me suis rendu compte qu'une unité de transformation de noix d'acajou ne coûte pas plus de $300 000, une unité complète avec la formation des ingénieurs et du personnel. Si vous regardez ça, vous vous rendez compte qu'avec un peu d'effort, nous pouvons créer la valeur chez nous en transformant les matières premières, parce que c'est seulement la stratégie économique qu'eux, ils ont fait. Je vous remercie.
Very good point. Thank you very much for making that point. Anybody else in the audience at all? I'm going to come to you in a moment, sir. Let me hear from you, madam, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to ask about wage subsidies. Just to hear from the panel if they think that there is room for wage subsidies for the youth in particular in Africa. And secondly, given that procurement is a demand market that is there in most of our countries, especially from governments, is there room for large-scale procurement, affirmative procurement for women, where there is goods that are manufactured that would create sustainable jobs for women?
Professor Adesina.
And if there's any country that is already doing that successfully.
Okay, I'd like you to answer that question.
Yeah. No, thanks very much. I think in terms of subsidies for the youth, to answer that, we should look at both the demand side of things and the supply side of things. Because even if we subsidize all the youth who actually go to get a labor market, if they don't have the skills to work in that. So we have to focus on making sure first that we have our skills, vocational training, skills, technical skills that people have to be able to actually fill the jobs that are going to be available. Now, if you look at the sector that actually has the greatest power to create the jobs, Mr. President just told you it's agriculture. I think the Africa Progress Panel report that was presented actually talked about the fact that 1/3 of all the jobs that Africa will need is going to come out to really agriculture. But I think it's agriculture where you're actually adding value because you create a lot more jobs as you go up on that particular value chain. Subsidies, let's take a look at the labor composition of that sector today. Today, you have average age of farmers, it's about 60, 55, 65, depending on the country, right? So we've got to really change that labor composition of the agricultural sector. To do that, you've got to change the mindset of the people. The young people have to know that agriculture is a business. It's a profitable business, as Mr. President was talking about. But then you've got to give them financing to start. Access to land, access to finance is very critical for them to be able to get a leg up in that kind of a market. So I think given the fact that we have this youth bulge and huge amount of unemployment, there's no doubt in my mind that we need to jumpstart people into jobs, that we have to actually provide them that bridging financing that helps them to get on the way. But I also want to say that there are other things that we have to do. You know, take public works programs, for example. Public works program can offer you jobs, but these are not necessarily the quality jobs you want. You know, and it can create a lot of dependency of people on the role of the state in terms of continuing to actually to subsidize that. The last one I want to make has to come back to this issue of infrastructure, which I think was raised by Professor Lee and also Mr. President. You know, President Kaberuka, when he became president of the bank, took a position which is fundamentally important, which is the fact that Africa cannot grow and actually create the sustainable jobs it needs and industrialization that it needs unless it has the infrastructure density and the diversity of infrastructure necessary to do that. So whether you're talking about, you know, transnational highways or you're talking about ports or rail and things like that are very, very important. And these are ways in which you create a lot of direct jobs, but also a lot of indirect jobs. So there's no doubt in my mind that we must invest quite a lot in infrastructure. I'll finish my point on the issue of soft skills. If you look today at our curriculum in our universities, and I think Mr. President mentioned it, alluded to it in his comments, it's totally disconnected. You know, we are not building entrepreneurship capacity within the universities. The curriculum is dated, the curriculum is outdated, it's not linked to the links of the labor market. So we've got to really, in particular, pay a lot of attention to that. And I will make a concrete suggestion here, because I started off with my point on the issue of mismatch and skills. The transaction cost for people in the labor markets to actually hire people is very high because of this mismatch. So why not create for example, skill enhancement hubs, massive amount of skill enhancement hubs, where the private sector actually works with the public sector. It's almost like you're doing the special economic zones, in which you create these particular areas where the private sector and the public sector are there. You have the social infrastructure there, you have the private sector there, and the private sector can then tell you, look, these are the kind of skills that we're looking for. And then you can have a pool of graduates that actually go through those kind of places, and then they can get trained to understand the kind of technical skills, soft skills that are needed, and then you can then have a pool in which you can employ. It's easier for those employers to then go there and say, look, we want to hire this, but this is a pool that have been given the right skills to have an elevator effect into the labor market. And I think African countries need to begin to do that, because when we say people should have skills and we don't get them into an area where we pull together to create that density of skills for them, we're wasting a lot of time. So I propose that we actually need to do a lot of that. And it's not something we can just say, let's train them over the internet and it's going to happen. No, I think we've got to really make sure that we do skill matching, skill upgrade, but in a way that we have economies of scale and scope in skills development for the labor market.
Thank you very much, sir. Now let me just come back to Your Excellency, Macky Sall. The political element is also very important. I imagine a lot of politicians, or a lot of, let me just say, a lot of presidents on the continent, it's a safer thing, the easier thing to say, are almost disconnected from the realities of the young people that they lead. Africa is a young continent, but the leadership in many ways is old. And that's not a bad thing, because it provides wisdom. But then one also has to wonder whether it also creates a disconnect between the ambitions of the young people, the aspirations, and the policies that are emerging from those governments.
C'est un grand sujet. Permettez-moi d'abord de saluer la présidente de la Commission de l'Union africaine, Madame Zuma, qui est notre présidente à nous. Et donc je dirais, pour reprendre votre propos, que normalement la vieillesse ou l'âge doit donner la sagesse. C'est le principe. Mais il faut reconnaître que le leadership politique se rajeunit en Afrique. Je crois que je suis un modèle. Vous avez d'autres modèles en Afrique centrale, en Afrique de l'Ouest. De plus en plus, il y a quand même une génération montante, dont une génération post-indépendante pour la plupart. Post-indépendante pour ceux qui l'ont été vers les années 60. Je ne parle pas des pays qui n'ont acquis l'indépendance qu'en 90. Donc ce seraient des présidents trop jeunes encore. Mais nous avons effectivement aujourd'hui, même pour les plus âgés, une communication forcément interactive et très forte avec la jeunesse africaine, puisqu'elle constitue la majorité de la population. Et donc pour un homme politique averti, il faudrait s'occuper de la jeunesse, sinon elle s'occupe de vous-même. Comme on le dit, occupez-vous de nous, ou bien nous vous occupons de vous, à travers la rue et tout ce qui peut en découler. Par conséquent, nous avons tous intérêt à revenir sur deux catégories, la jeunesse, mais aussi les femmes. Les femmes, puisque c'est une question finalement d'équité, puisqu'elles sont majoritaires dans la population africaine aujourd'hui. Elles sont en moyenne, dans la plupart des pays, autour de 52%. Et nous venons de lancer avec la Banque africaine de développement un projet pilote qu'on appelle le projet d'appui pour l'emploi des jeunes et des femmes, le PAPEJ, pour à peu près 36 millions de dollars. Ce projet a pour vocation de faciliter la petite transformation de produits agricoles, de produits de la mer, par des groupements féminins où on donne une valeur ajoutée. Le Sénégal étant un pays côtier, il y a beaucoup de transformations de produits de la mer vers des produits qui auront une plus grande conservation, tout ce qui est poisson séché, enfin tout ce qui concerne les céphalopodes et autres gastéropodes qui sont transformés. En tout cas, ceux du pays côtier savent que c'est une plus-value importante. Nous y travaillons, tout comme pour la transformation justement des produits agricoles, tels que mon compatriote l'a dit, la transformation de la noix de cajou, de l'arachide, dans différentes variétés, le beurre d'arachide, Et tout cela, ces projets les prennent en compte et donnent une valeur ajoutée aux femmes, en plus d'une formation en comptabilité primaire. Et je pense que nous avons aussi dans le même projet la vocation de développer des fermes modernes pour des jeunes diplômés comme non diplômés qui seront formés dans les matériaux agricoles modernes, disons l'irrigation goutte à goutte, la mécanisation par tracteur et enfin la production agricole de façon à les initier et à en faire des entrepreneurs agricoles. Je pense que si ce projet passe, nous pourrons l'élargir à l'échelle nationale et en faire véritablement un des piliers d'emploi, mais aussi de création de richesses à la base. Donc je suis pour la discrimination positive à l'égard des femmes en matière de financement de projets et je suis également pour le financement de l'emploi non salarié, puisque l'emploi salarié ne peut pas prendre en charge les besoins d'emploi en Afrique. Il faut que cela aussi soit clairement dit et que les gouvernements évitent la politique, j'allais dire populiste, qui consiste à faire croire à la jeunesse qu'on peut vous offrir autant d'emplois que vous voulez parce que le gouvernement n'a pas vocation à créer des emplois. Le gouvernement doit créer les conditions du développement du plein emploi, les conditions du développement de l'investissement privé et les conditions d'une régulation pour que l'investissement réponde à ces impératifs. Bien sûr, le gouvernement aura toujours des emplois pour la sécurité, la santé, l'éducation, mais c'est une portion congrue par rapport aux besoins d'emploi et il faut que nous apprenions aussi à dire la vérité à notre jeunesse, à dire la vérité à nos peuples et à montrer ce qui est possible et ce qu'il faut faire comme voie dans la formation, dans les efforts que nous faisons pour l'éducation de nos enfants, que ce soit pour l'enseignement public, l'enseignement supérieur, mais surtout pour la formation professionnelle qui, de mon point de vue, doit être le nouveau paradigme pour répondre aux besoins, n'est-ce pas, de l'investissement nouveau. Voilà ce que je voulais rajouter sur ce point.
Thank you very much. Yes, let me have a comment from you, sir.
Let me just clarify. My name is Fisahation again, but I'm the Vice President of International Leadership Institute in Addis Ababa. But at the same time,
the Netherlands.
But at the same time, contracted to find ways and means of mobilizing resources for African Union. So I hope that is clarified. Let me just try the same point. The issue of generating employment. Frankly speaking, we need to balance between, on one hand, trying to focus on capital-intensive and high-tech intensive projects vis-à-vis employment. To me, if we want to promote and generate employment, then we have to focus on labor-intensive activities, projects, and so forth. As has been said, agriculture is an important factor. But even in manufacturing, by the way, the problem arises that we are more infatuated by ICT and so forth, high-tech, high-cost activities, which tend to displace labor. The other problem I see is also that our educational system has not been integrated into agriculture, into developing skills related to agriculture as well as to industry. Our education system has been totally fragmented. So there is a need for a systematic and integrated and holistic approach to employment generation. The other thing I noticed is that the relationship between the private sector, whether it's FDI or others, is not integrated into the employment agenda of government. For example, foreign investors come, they do whatever they like, and there are little preconditions that would induce or convince foreign investors to give the type of training and skill that is required. So we need to link between the employment problem of a country and attraction of foreign investors. This is absolutely crucial. What they do is, okay, for foreign investors, investing in training is costly for them as well. So either we have to provide a subsidy which would link up to the type of appropriate skill generation and employment, or we need to integrate the public and private sector in order to generate employment.
You make a very important point. Thank you very much. I'm going to
Thank you.
allow His Excellency Macky Sall to make a remark in that respect if you have any final thoughts at all, because I know that he has to leave to go and be a part of a TV program in a few minutes.
Thank you very much. Juste un petit commentaire pour quand même consolider ce qu'il vient de dire. Dans certains secteurs comme les TIC, alors précisément, je prends l'exemple du secteur des télécommunications au Sénégal, qui est un secteur dynamique qui fait 12% de notre croissance, mais qui ne donne que 3 000 emplois pour tous les opérateurs réunis. C'est à peine 3 000 emplois. Moi, je viens de prendre récemment un décret qui d'ailleurs sera publié cette semaine pour pousser un peu vers la création d'emplois en limitant les automates pour certaines prestations. Par exemple, les services de renseignement, pour demander des prix, demander un certain nombre de renseignements à ces opérateurs. Si on réduisait l'accès des automates, qui sont des machines qui tournent et qui font payer d'ailleurs parfois la clientèle, en mettant des opérateurs d'appel au bout du fil qui réagissent, c'est tout de suite 1000 emplois qui sont créés et qui donc vont contribuer à augmenter. Donc il y a des niches qu'il faut regarder, ça et là, bien sûr, dans le respect du développement de l'investissement privé, mais il faut également que les investisseurs participent dans la création d'emplois. Autrement, nous aurons une croissance non inclusive qui à terme sera une croissance négative, puisque source de conflits, source de tensions, et donc autant l'État que l'investisseur et le citoyen, nous devons tous travailler pour aller vers des secteurs davantage porteurs de croissance. Et dans tous les secteurs, ces niches d'emploi existent. Il faut une convergence et surtout une harmonie dans la définition des missions. Je voulais juste prendre cet exemple de télécom pour consolider ce qu'il a dit.
Let's give His Excellency Macky Sall a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And let's also just stand up as His Excellency leaves us to go and be a part of another of the sessions that are taking place at the moment. Let's give him a round of applause again. Thank you very much, sir. So President Macky Sall is leaving, and let's again thank him very much for being a part of this afternoon's session. I know that there are very many questions that are lingering, and those questions can begin as soon as Thank you very much, President Macky Sall, for making time to speak to us. Now, let me just have a remark coming from the lady sitting at the back. Yes. Let's give a microphone to the lady sitting at the back as we continue our discussions for the next few moments. Oh, His Excellency is still leaving, you see. Yes, let's get a microphone here. One of the members, the teams in the House. Yes, please. The lady at the front here, if you can. Okay, just make your comment and then we'll hear from her as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it's working.
Thank you. My name is Aaron Maute. I'm the head of the capital market regulator in Nigeria. I may have missed it, but I thought that in general, small and medium-scale enterprises help us create jobs. So I'd like Mr. Shankar to help us with examples of how you can scale up the support of sustainable small and medium-scale enterprises by making funding more easily available, particularly from the domestic capital market.
Good point.
I'd also like to hear from Mr. Lin about the examples, because one of the great successes in China is about what small and medium-scale enterprises have done. And I would like to hear from the Honorable Minister of Agriculture for Nigeria about some of what they've done in Nigeria, or what we've done, I should say, in Nigeria to catalyze support for small and medium-scale enterprises.
Okay, thank you very much.
As well
I'm
as
gonna
from
have,
the ECA
yeah, okay, we need to redeem some time. We need to redeem some time. So I'm going to come back to the panel in a few moments.
I was very short.
Yeah, sure. Let me just ask this lady to ask her question. And yes, and then just make a note of the questions that you are going to ask, you to answer, if you may, gentlemen. Yes, madam. It's taking a little bit longer to get the microphones around, but yes.
Thank you. I'm very passionate about university education, and I want to thank the president of the bank for having overhauled the teaching at the technical level. However, when Professor Desina talked about an outdated curriculum, I was very concerned, because really we do have commissions for university education, and they have the mandate to go through this curriculum, and we have curriculum reviews. We also have performance contracts whereby some of these reforms are tracked. However, we have issues that I believe governments are not addressing. The dynamics at the university, what is really bringing this mismatch between the skills and the jobs. For example, you may need to teach about a new technology, but you don't have the equipment. The University of Nairobi, for example, I know, engineering, they have very old equipment. So if you are going to orient towards the new that is not available, how will that be delivered?
Okay.
And then in the social sciences also, the paradigm is learning by rumor. We have a class like this. Students don't hear what the teachers say, and they ask, so what did the teachers say? They learn by rumor. Some of our organizations, we are coming up with programs to revolutionize teaching, but this is being left to the NGOs. So how can we upscale? Professor Desina, I'm working with some universities in Nigeria. We'll be coming to you to help us get some funding, get government attention, so that we can upscale
Was that what this was about,
doing.
some funding and government attention?
No,
Okay.
it's about revolutionizing teaching so that we can realize the skills that we want.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, I'm going to come to Helen in a moment. She's the lady from Ethiopia and China. She'll explain what that means shortly. But if you may respond, please, starting with you.
No, that's fine. I think to Aruma Ote's point on the SMEs in agriculture. If you take, for example, the SMEs in the agricultural sector, so take, for example, the small agro dealers, that are the ones that sell you seeds and fertilizers in almost every African country. The challenge they have is, basically to get access to finance to move their products into rural areas. And banks don't lend them money. It doesn't matter whether it was in Tanzania or in Uganda and so on, when we started looking for ways to get finance into them. But today, all of that has changed. Take Nigeria, for example. In 2011, because of a risk-sharing instrument that we put in place in Nigeria, via the Central Bank of Nigeria and my ministry, we were able to get the banks to lend them $10 million US. Well, last year, the banks lent them $53 million US. And 2 years in a row, the rate of default on that is 0%. And so you can see the amount of jobs that those have created. President Kappa, if you look at Tanzania, when I was in Rockefeller Foundation, we did this work with the agro dealers that were in Klimbero and all of that. Today, the NMB, National Microfinance Bank, lends massively to agro dealers all across. So, and these are creating direct jobs for the agro dealers, but also a lot of jobs, actually on-farm and indirect jobs as well. So I do think that the small, medium-scale enterprises can offer a huge amount of jobs in Africa. There's no doubt about it. Now, when it comes to the issue of the curriculum, I look forward to see you in Nigeria. But I think the problem we have with curriculum in Africa is that we produce a lot of labels. We don't produce competencies, right? So somebody goes out and say, I have a BA in this or BS in this and MS in that. It's just a label. If you actually go and ask the employers of labor whether they have the kind of skills that are needed for managerial position, they will say no. I'll give you an example again from agriculture. We have so many companies that are coming to Africa today from FDI, investing in agribusinesses. Number one problem they have, they can't find the people with the skills. You know, they have to bring in people from outside. And so that's why I'm saying that the curriculum in our universities really have to change. We have to ask the employers of labor, what kind of skills are they looking for? And make sure that our curriculum and training actually allows our graduates to be robust graduates that can come out, not just become job hunters, but become job creators themselves, become entrepreneurial. Right. And I think that's what's really missing. And I think we must absolutely lock that in if we want to use our graduates to create jobs, not just be on the streets, actually looking for others to employ them.
Okay, Mr. Shankar.
The question on SME. SMEs prosper and thrive when they are part of an ecosystem where they are supplying to larger companies. They can't exist in isolation. So I think the whole thing has to come back to creating a suitable industrial policy. In fact, I would like to call it countries need more of a jobs policy, not just a GDP policy or an inflation policy. We should target jobs. And SMEs are obviously have to be a very, very important part of that construct. And banks will be more willing to lend if the SMEs have ready buyers and they are part of a supply chain. Having said that, I absolutely agree with the minister that you need to have certain directed lending to SMEs. I know bankers in the audience will kill me for saying that, but it's okay to get killed for saying the right thing. I think unless we have some sort of quotas for how much amount of lending banks should do to SMEs, it may not quite happen. Now, of course, governments can support that by giving guarantees, by giving subsidies, and lots of other things. The point on education, I absolutely agree. The focus of education has been on educating rather than on employability. The more we can gear education towards employability, we'd be better off. Good example of that is Singapore. Singapore is a country which is known for its education, but what is less well known is the fact that less than 50% of the people who graduate from a high school go to college. More than 50% actually go to polytechnics, which are very much geared to job creation. So if the country is focusing on petrochemicals, there'll be guys focused on, or if it is focusing on aircraft, it'll be on welders, lathe machine operators, whatever else. So I think more of that directed education stuff is important. And I just want to put in a plug for something that I am involved with now as part of one of the non-bank activities. It's an effort called Business Backs Education. Because ultimately the biggest beneficiaries of education has to be the business. And to the extent that, and all we are asking companies to do is to make a pledge that 20%, now this doesn't have to happen today, directionally, 20% of their CSR spending is directed towards education.
Okay.
That's to create that ecosystem.
All right, thank you very much. Very briefly, I'm giving Helen 2 minutes here. We've run out of time. We literally should be closing down now. 2 minutes, literally. I'll interrupt you at the 2-minute mark.
Okay, I think today we talk about jobs. I just want to say we also should talk about decent jobs. But who should judge is it decent or not? I give you one example. I came to Ethiopia in 2011. Within 6 months' time, I doubled the export revenue for shoe sector. By month 12, I hired 2,000 workers. And by month 13, I put advertise to recruit 100 workers, just a small notice. How many people came to the door? 3,000 people came to the door. If it's not decent jobs, they would not come in here. So I think it's not politician or NGO should judge whether it's decent. It should be the workers themselves to judge whether it's decent. That's number one. And quickly, number two, I just wanted to say, I didn't choose Ethiopia. It was actually the late Prime Minister came to China to pick us. And then one thing really touched my heart during my first visit to Ethiopia, because we wrote a check actually after seeing the poor condition in Ethiopia of $100,000. We gave it to the Minister of Industry. You know what the minister did? He returned the check to me. He said to me, Helen, I don't need you to give me fish. Please help me to catch fish, and I want you to come here to invest. I'm not a politician, and I'm not an economist, but I'm an investor, but I do have my choice whether to invest in Africa or somewhere else. But I think it's also Africa's choice whether you want to invite investors like me or not. Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause. Mr. Lopez has not said much, and we do need to wind up, so I'll give you the opportunity.
No, I just wanted to qualify this issue about skills. And I know it's a subject that has a lot of passion associated with it, and we thank the chairperson for being one of the drivers of this passion about the skills revolution in Africa. But we have to get the sequence right. Right now, for the type of manufacturing jobs that we are talking about, we already have the skills. Let's not be mistaken. We have as good skills as Bangladesh. There's no reason China is investing in Bangladesh and not in Africa. 32% of Africans have a secondary degree diploma. With all the difficulties and all the pitfalls that are associated with it, is more than adequate for the low-end value chain of manufacturing that creates most of the jobs. Let's not be mistaken about this. We need the skills revolution to get to a higher value chain, to get to better jobs. But right now, we can do with what we have, and we can create a lot of jobs with manufacturing.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's a good note upon which to end. Let's give him a round of applause. And I've got to say thank you very much to my very distinguished panel. And Professor Lin from Peking University, the Honorable Adesina from Nigeria, Minister of Agriculture Development, and also Mr. Lopez from UNECA. And we've got to say thank you very much to Mr. V. Shankar from Standard Chartered Bank. Let's give them a round of applause. And I'd also like to say thank you very much for His Excellency Macky Sall for making time to speak to us. I'd also like to thank Her Excellency Mrs. Zuma for being a part of this afternoon session, and His Excellency President Mukapa for being a part of this afternoon session as well. And I'd also like to recognize the very senior guests that have been a part of this afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Alan Kasuja, and thank you for being a brilliant